Let's now work on the orders. And there, let's start with the logic for adding an order. Obviously, when you add an order, that should also be stored on the server. Now, the logic for that will be pretty similar to what we used for adding a product. So you can definitely have a look at the add product method to learn how to add an order. And actually, I'll copy a bit of that. So I'll copy that URL, for example, go to the order start file, and add it here. Also, I'll turn this into an async function, which will therefore return a future, which yields void in the end. And now I want to use the HTTP package in here, so we should import it, of course. So let's import package HTTP and their HTTP Dart. And again, I'll bundle this all with the HTTP prefix to access all the features from that package with HTTP dot. With that, here, I want to send a request. And that should be a post request because I want to add a new order on the server. Send it to that URL. And of course, we need to append a body here. Now that body needs to be in JSON format. So let's also import Dart convert here to create some JSON, to convert our map to JSON. So here we can then call JSON encode, pass in a map. And in that map, I want to store all the data which should be stored on the server in the end. So what makes up an order? An order looks like this. We have an ID. Well, that will be generated by Firebase, so we don't need to store that. But we'll have an amount, a date time, and then also we'll have some products. And the products in turn are cart products. And we find the definition for that in the cart Dart file. A cart item in turn has an ID, a title, a quantity, and a price. So we'll need to convert all of that into maps. So actually here we'll have a map with then a list of nested maps inside of it. So let's start working on that. We'll have our amount, and the amount is simply the total we get here. That's simple. Now for the date time, for the timestamp, we can use date time now and convert this to a ISO 8601 string, which is simply a uniform string representation of dates, which we can later easily convert back into a datetime object when we load this into Dart again. Because we can't just send a datetime object like this. We don't want to send its normal string representation. Instead, we want to send this special string representation, which is easily recreatable as a datetime later then. So that's fine, but actually that's already the first thing which you could mess up. We're using that timestamp also down there in the order item which we create for our local memory. That of course should be exactly the same timestamp as up there. But if we execute a HTTP request in between, there will be some difference in the timestamps. So actually, I'll first create my timestamp here with date time now, and then use that timestamp that is created at the beginning of this function execution here to send it to a server, and here to then use it locally, so that we have exactly the same timestamp. And then here for the data we do send to a server, we of course also have our products. And our products is actually a list that can be encoded to JSON just like a map. But that list here now needs to have our cart products. Now cart products is a list, but a list of cart items. And we need to map these cart items into maps and not have objects. So here I will use cart products map, and then you call toList to get a list again. And in map we get a function which runs on every CP, on every cart product. And there I want to now return a new map. So convert my objects here based on cart item into maps. And there every map will have an ID. So basically the same fields I have here for the cart item, ID, title, quantity, and price. So I will have an ID here, which is cp.id. And I'll have a title, which is cp.title. And I'll have a quantity, which is cp.quantity here. And I'll have a price, which is cp.price. So that's how the product should look like here in that map. And with that, we now have our order representation, a representation of an order item, which we can send to the server. Now we already added async, so we can now use await here to wait for the response. And indeed, I will use the response then. We could add error handling, by the way, wrap try catch around that, or wrap try catch around the place where you call add order later if you want to. Again, I will leave out error handling here to save some time, but I still want to use the response here because that response will hold an ID which is generated by Firebase, which I want to use here instead of this dummy ID. So here I want to decode my response body, and that will be that map which has that name key, which is that auto-generated ID. It's the same pattern we used in products. Here in add product, we also got the auto-generated ID like this, and I'm using the same pattern now to get that auto-generated ID for the order. And that should be all. We add our order locally once this is done with a wait. We're waiting for this to be done before this executes. And again, always remember, technically this gets wrapped into a then block. We're not really stopping code execution. But now with that, we can go to the place where we call add order and, well, see if everything is good there and maybe show a loading spinner. Because we call add order in our card screen. There we have that flat button, order now, and there I call add order. Now there, I of course want to show a loading spinner instead of that text, and also disable the button whilst we're loading. And I also, by the way, want to disable the button if we have nothing to order. So we have nothing to order if card here has a total amount that is equal to or smaller than 0. So the first thing we can do here actually, and we could have done that before, is that we check card total amount, and if that's smaller or equal than 0, then onPressed should point at null instead of that function. And if onPressed points at null instead of a function, Flutter automatically disables the button. That's a nice feature. So the button is automatically disabled if onPressed has no function to point at. And that's the case if the total amount is smaller or equal to 0. But now I also want to manage some loading state to show a spinner and also disable the button there. And for that, we can turn this into a stateful widget, or to avoid rebuilding everything just because we're switching this here to show a loading spinner, we can of course also extract that flat button into a separate widget, which might be more elegant here. So we can use the refactoring tool to extract a widget here, and I'll name this order button. And by default, that's placed in the same file. And here I'll actually leave it in that file because the order button is really only used by that widget, by that card screen widget. So whilst you could absolutely move the order button into a separate file and it would not be wrong, whilst you could do that, you can also leave it here because we'll never use it anywhere else. Now order button is already configured to receive the card, which is good because we need the card total amount here. However, we now need to convert this into a stateful widget, which we again can do with the refactoring tool. Because now here, we can add the isLoading property, which initially is false. And I want to set this to true in here, and inside of setState, of course, to update this UI when we start loading. So I'll set this to true. And now that's why I put this into a separate widget. With setState, we now only re-execute this build method instead of that entire build method up there. So we rebuild less, which is of course not bad. And here, by the way, you can remove new, which was added. This is not required as of Dart 2 anymore. So now here on the order button, we call setState when we start loading. Now, of course, this here returns a future. So actually, I'll add async here between the parameter list and the body of this anonymous function. You can use async on anonymous functions as well. Because of course I want to await this now. I don't care about the result because the result will be void anyways, but I want to await this before I clear the card and also before I reset my loading state, of course. So here I'll set loading back to false once we're done. So with that, the last thing is that I also want to disable the button whilst we're loading. So here, I'll not just check for the card amount, but this should also be disabled. So I also want to set onPressed to null if we either have this condition or if isLoading is true. And now with that, let's do a full restart and let's see whether that works. Let's add a couple of items to the cart here. And now here, if I click order now, gets disabled. And after a while, the items are gone. They end up here in orders, and I also have my order here. Now, incorrectly in products, so I'll actually clear that here. That's a mistake. In order start, of course, I don't want to target products JSON, but a new node like orders JSON. The name is up to you, because of course it should be not stored in the same list as the products, but in a separate list. That's a mistake. So make sure to clear that here on Firebase and remove the order from the products and update the URL. And the other missing thing is that I'm not showing a spinner. I do disable the button, that's good, but actually I want to show a spinner instead of order now if we're loading. So here I'll check is loading, and if we are loading, then I'll show a circular progress indicator, and only if we're not loading, I'll show that text here. So these are the two things which need to be changed, and with that, let's do a hot refresh again to reload the app. Add a couple of items here to the cart. And now click order now, and here's the spinner, and after a while it's gone. And now on Firebase, we also see that this item was added to the orders node. And there we have all the data we wanted to send. So this is looking good. And with that, we're storing the orders. Let's next make sure that we can also fetch them.